The dark waters of Hong Kong harbor reflected the glow of ship lanterns as Commodore George Dewey stood on the bridge of his flagship, the USS Olympia, his weathered hands gripping the rail with quiet determination. It was late April of 1898 and war had finally come to America's doorstep. The explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor had ignited a powder keg of American fury. But few realized that the first decisive blow would be struck not in Cuban waters, but 7,000 miles away in the exotic Philippines. Dewey's Asiatic squadron had been preparing for this moment for months. The grizzled Commodore, with his piercing blue eyes and meticulously waxed mustache, had transformed his small fleet into a razor-sharp instrument of naval warfare. His squadron consisted of 4 cruisers, the USS Olympia, USS Baltimore, USS Raleigh, and USS Boston, along with 2 gunboats, the USS Concord and USS Petrel. Each vessel gleamed with fresh paint and bristled with modern artillery. Their crews drilled to mechanical precision. The Spanish Pacific Squadron, commanded by Rear Admiral Patricio Montoya y Pasaron, presented a stark contrast to the American force. Montoya's fleet consisted of aging wooden ships, their hulls worn by tropical weather and their armament hopelessly outdated. The flagship Reina Cristina, built in 1887, was considered modern by Spanish standards. But her iron plates and obsolete guns would prove no match for American steel and explosive shells. As tensions escalated throughout April, Dewey received his historic orders from Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt. The telegram was brief but electrifying. Proceed to the Philippine Islands and destroy the Spanish fleet. The Commodore's jaw tightened as he read the message. He had waited his entire career for such an opportunity, and he would not waste it. Intelligence. Reports painted a grim picture of Spanish defenses. Manila Bay was protected by several fortifications, including Fort San Antonio de Abad and the Cavite Arsenal, where Montoya had positioned his squadron. The Spanish commander faced an impossible choice: fight in the deep waters of Manila Bay, where his ships could maneuver but would be exposed to American firepower, or retreat to the shallow waters near Cavite, where coastal batteries could provide support but his larger vessels would be vulnerable to grounding. The American squadron departed Hong Kong on April 27th, sailing through the South China Sea under a blanket of secrecy. Dewey had ordered complete radio silence, knowing that Spanish agents were likely monitoring communications. As the ships cut through the tropical waters, their crews engaged in final preparations, ammunition was distributed, guns were cleaned and tested, and battle stations were assigned and rehearsed. The Commodore spent long hours studying charts of Manila Bay, memorizing every depth, current, and navigational hazard. He knew that success would depend not just on superior firepower, but on precise seamanship and tactical brilliance. The Spanish might have the advantage of fighting in their home waters, but Dewey possessed something far more valuable: absolute confidence in his men and their mission. As the squadron approached the Philippine archipelago, lookouts reported smoke on the horizon, Spanish patrol vessels hastily retreating to Manila to warn of the approaching American fleet. The element of surprise was lost, but Dewey remained unperturbed. He had come too far to turn back now, and Admiral Montoya would soon discover that all the warning in the world could not prepare his antiquated fleet for the storm that was about to break upon them. The stage was set for one of the most decisive naval engagements in American history. A battle that would announce America's emergence as a global naval power and forever change the balance of power in the Pacific. In the pre-dawn darkness of May 1st, 1898, 2 fleets prepared to write history in smoke and steel. The pre-dawn hours of May 1st, 1898, found the American squadron silently gliding through the darkness toward the mouth of Manila Bay. Commodore Dewey stood on the bridge of the USS Olympia, his white uniform crisp despite the humid tropical air, watching as the shadowy outline of Corregidor Island emerged from the morning mist. The tension aboard each vessel was palpable. Sailors checked their equipment one final time while officers studied their battle plans by dim lamplight. At 2:30 in the morning, the fleet began its approach to Boca Grande, the main entrance. To Manila Bay, Dewey had chosen this route despite its risks, knowing that the Spanish would expect him to use the wider but more heavily defended Boca Chica passage. The Commodore's gamble paid off initially, as the squadron slipped past the outer defenses undetected, their engines running at minimum power to reduce noise and smoke. The Spanish coastal batteries, manned by nervous gunners who had been on high alert for days, finally spotted the American ships as they passed between Corregidor and Caballo Islands. The first Spanish shell screamed overhead at 5:15 a.m., its orange flash illuminating the water around the USS Boston. More guns opened fire from El Fraile Island, their muzzle flashes creating a deadly light show in the pre-dawn gloom. Dewey remained calm as enemy shells splashed around his flagship, some passing dangerously close to the Olympia's superstructure. He had anticipated this gauntlet and ordered his ships to maintain course and speed without returning fire. The American vessels were built for open ocean combat, not shore bombardment. And engaging the fortifications would only delay their primary mission, the destruction of Admiral Montoya's fleet. As the squadron cleared the entrance and entered the broad expanse of Manila Bay, lookouts reported the Spanish fleet anchored in a defensive line near Cavite, approximately 7 miles to the south. Through his binoculars, Dewey could see the enemy vessels clearly. 7 warships led by the cruiser Reina Cristina, supported by several gunboats and torpedo boats. The Spanish had positioned themselves with their backs to the Cavite naval arsenal, hoping to benefit from shore battery support. Admiral Montoya had made his fateful decision to fight in shallow water, believing that his crews could be rescued more easily if their ships were sunk in the shallows. This defensive mindset revealed the Spanish commander's lack of confidence in his fleet's ability to match the Americans in open combat. The ships were anchored in line-ahead formation, a static arrangement that would prove disastrously inflexible. In the coming battle, the American squadron approached in column formation, with the USS Olympia leading the line, followed by the USS Baltimore, USS Raleigh, USS Petrel, USS Concord, and USS Boston. This arrangement allowed maximum firepower to be brought to bear while maintaining tactical flexibility. Dewey's battle plan was elegantly simple: steam parallel to the Spanish, line at close range, and systematically destroy each enemy vessel with concentrated gunfire. At 5:40 a.m., as the morning sun cast long shadows across the bay, Commodore Dewey turned to his flag captain Charles Vernon Gridley, spoke the words that would echo through American naval history. "You may fire when you are ready, Gridley." The captain immediately passed the order to the gun crews, and at a range of 5,500 yards, USS Olympia's 8-inch forward turret erupted in flame and thunder. According to historical records from the U.S. Navy's official documentation, the opening American salvo marked the beginning of the most lopsided naval victory in United States history. The Spanish return fire was immediate, but largely ineffective, their obsolete guns lacking both the range and accuracy of American artillery. The Reina Cristina, brave but outmatched, attempted to close distance with the American line, but was met with devastating fire from multiple ships. The waters of Manila Bay began to churn with the impact of shells in the wakes of maneuvering vessels. Black smoke poured from Spanish funnels as their crews desperately tried to get underway, while the disciplined American column maintained perfect formation, each ship firing in sequence as it passed the enemy line. The Battle of Manila Bay had begun in earnest, and within minutes it became clear that Admiral Montoya's antiquated fleet faced not just defeat, but complete annihilation. The morning of May 1st erupted in a symphony of destruction as the American squadron unleashed its full fury upon the Spanish fleet. The USS Olympia's guns spoke first, their shells screaming across the water to bracket the enemy line with towering columns of spray and debris. Within moments, the entire American column was engaged, each ship's artillery adding to the crescendo of battle that rolled across Manila Bay like thunder from the gods of war. Admiral Montoya's flagship, the Reina Cristina, bore the brunt of the initial American assault. The Spanish cruiser's antiquated armor, designed to stop solid shot rather than explosive shells, proved woefully inadequate against modern American ordnance. Shell after shell crashed into her superstructure, each impact sending showers of splinters and twisted metal across her decks. Her crew, showing remarkable courage in the face of overwhelming firepower, continued to serve their guns even as their ship disintegrated around them. The Spanish admiral himself stood on his bridge, his uniform torn and bloodied by flying debris, shouting orders that could barely be heard above the roar of battle. Montoyo had accepted the impossibility of his situation with grim determination, knowing that Spanish honor demanded he fight to the bitter end, regardless of the odds. His obsolete guns fired defiantly at the American column, their solid shot, bouncing harmlessly off modern steel armor, or falling short in great splashes of foam. Commodore Dewey, observing the battle from the USS Olympia's bridge, noted with professional satisfaction how his ships maintained perfect formation despite the chaos of combat. The American column steamed in a precise oval pattern, allowing each vessel to bring its full broadside to bear on the Spanish line during each pass. This tactical evolution, practiced extensively during peacetime maneuvers, demonstrated the superior training and discipline of the American crews. The USS Baltimore, second in line, concentrated her fire on the Spanish cruiser Castilla, an ancient, wooden vessel that had no business in a modern naval battle. Captain Nehemiah Mayo Dyer's gunners found their range quickly, and their shells set the Castilla ablaze within minutes. The old ship's wooden hull, despite being protected by iron plates, proved fatally vulnerable to high-explosive projectiles that started fires faster than her crew could extinguish them. Meanwhile, the smaller American vessels were engaged in a deadly game with Spanish torpedo boats and gunboats. The USS Petrel and USS Concord, though lightly armored, possessed superior speed and firepower compared to their Spanish counterparts. Their rapid-fire guns swept the enemy's smaller vessels with devastating effect. Turning the wooden gunboats into floating pyres within minutes of engagement, the Spanish shore batteries at Cavite Arsenal joined the battle with enthusiasm but little effect. Their ancient guns, some dating back to the American Civil War era, lacked both the range and accuracy to seriously threaten the American squadron. Most of their shots fell well short of their targets, sending up harmless geysers of water that served only to mark their positions for counter-battery fire. As the battle progressed, the disparity between the two forces became increasingly apparent. American gunnery, trained to surgical precision through countless drills and exercises, found its targets with methodical accuracy. Spanish returned fire, though brave and determined, proved largely ineffective against modern armor and superior seamanship. The technological gap between the two fleets, representing different eras of naval warfare, is measured in shattered steel and burning timber. By 6:30 in the morning, the Spanish line was in complete disarray. The Reina Cristina, her hull, pierced by dozens of shells and her superstructure ablaze, attempted a desperate ramming attack on the USS Olympia. Admiral Montoyo, displaying the courage that had made Spanish naval officers legendary, ordered his flagship to charge directly at the American flagship in a final act of defiance. The gallant but futile charge ended in tragedy as concentrated. Fire from multiple American ships turned the Reina Cristina into a floating inferno. Her boilers, struck by several shells, exploded in a column of steam and debris that could be seen from Manila itself. The Spanish flagship, her back broken and her colors still flying, began to settle by the stern as her surviving crew abandoned ship. As smoke cleared across the bay, it became evident that the Spanish Pacific Squadron had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. But Commodore Dewey was far from finished. The complete destruction of enemy naval power in the Philippines had only just begun, and the most dramatic moments of the battle still lay ahead in the morning mist. As the smoke of battle drifted across Manila Bay, Commodore Dewey faced a moment that would define his career and America's naval future. At 7:35 in the morning, with half the Spanish fleet already destroyed or burning, he made the decision that shocked both his officers and the enemy observers watching from Manila's shoreline. The American squadron ceased fire and withdrew to the center of the bay, leaving the Spanish to wonder if their desperate resistance had somehow succeeded in driving off the attackers. The truth was far more practical and revealing of Dewey's methodical nature. Reports from his ship captains indicated that ammunition was running dangerously low, and several vessels reported mechanical problems with their main batteries. Rather than risk a Pyrrhic victory, the Commodore ordered a tactical withdrawal. To assess damage, redistribute ammunition, and allow his crews a much-needed rest. This pause would also give him time to evaluate the effectiveness of Spanish shore batteries and plan the final assault. Admiral Montoyo, bloodied but unbowed aboard what remained of his flagship, interpreted the American withdrawal as a sign of weakness. The Spanish commander, despite witnessing the destruction of most of his fleet, maintained the fighting spirit that characterized his nation's naval tradition. He used the lull to reorganize his surviving vessels and prepare for what he believed would be a renewed assault that his remaining guns might yet repel. The break in combat allowed both sides to take stock of the morning's carnage. For the Americans, the damage was remarkably light. Several ships reported minor hits from Spanish shells, and the USS Baltimore had suffered some damage to her superstructure, but no American vessel was seriously impaired. Most importantly, casualties were almost non-existent, with only a handful of sailors reporting minor wounds from flying splinters. The Spanish situation was catastrophic. The Reina Cristina lay at the bottom of the bay, her broken hull visible beneath the clear tropical water. The wooden cruiser Castilla was a burning hulk, her crew having abandoned ship after repeated hits from American shells. Several smaller vessels had been completely destroyed, their wreckage scattered across the anchorage like broken toys. During the lull, Dewey received an intelligence report that would change the course of the battle. Filipino insurgents, led by Emilio Aguinaldo, had been fighting Spanish colonial rule for years and saw the American attack as an opportunity for liberation. Messages from revolutionary leaders indicated their willingness to support American operations and provide crucial intelligence about Spanish defensive positions. The Commodore also used this time to communicate with his fleet captains, ensuring that each ship understood its role in the final phase of the battle. The USS Olympia and USS Baltimore would concentrate on destroying the remaining Spanish cruisers, while the smaller vessels would systematically eliminate gunboats and torpedo boats. Shore batteries would be engaged only if they posed a serious threat to American operations. As the morning progressed, crowds gathered along Manila's waterfront to witness the unprecedented spectacle. Many Filipino residents, oppressed by centuries of Spanish colonial rule, cheered openly for the American attackers. Spanish officials and military personnel watched in growing despair as their Pacific fleet faced annihilation before their eyes. At 10:40 a.m., Commodore Dewey signaled his squadron to resume the attack. The American vessels, their ammunition redistributed and their crews refreshed, formed into battle line once more. This time, however, the approach was more deliberate and methodical. Dewey had learned from the morning's engagement and intended to complete the destruction of Spanish naval power with surgical precision. The renewal of combat found the Spanish in an even more desperate situation. Their ammunition was nearly exhausted. Several ships were taking on water from previous damage, and crew morale was understandably shaken. Admiral Montoyo, transferring his flag to the gunboat Isla de Cuba after losing the Reina Cristina, prepared for what he knew would be his fleet's final stand. According to detailed records maintained by the U.S. Navy Historical Center, the second phase of the battle demonstrated American naval gunnery at its most devastating. The systematic destruction that followed would establish new standards for naval warfare and prove that the age of wooden warships had definitively ended. The USS Olympia led the renewed attack, her guns now finding targets with mechanical precision. Each salvo was aimed with mathematical accuracy, and the Spanish vessels, unable to maneuver effectively in the shallow water, became sitting targets for American artillerists. The one-sided nature of the engagement was becoming apparent to observers on both sides. But Spanish honor demanded that the battle continue until the last gun fell silent. The second phase of the Battle of Manila Bay commenced with the methodical precision of an execution. At 11:15 a.m., Commodore Dewey's renewed assault systematically eliminated what remained of Admiral Montoyo's fleet with devastating efficiency. The USS Olympia, her guns now perfectly ranged, Next, opened fire on the Spanish gunboat Don Antonio de Ulloa, which had been attempting to provide cover for damaged Spanish vessels seeking refuge near the Cavite arsenal. The Spanish gunboat, gallantly defending her position, was hopelessly outmatched. American attention shells crashed into her thin plating with tremendous impact, each hit sending geysers of steam and debris skyward. Within minutes, the Don Antonio de Ulloa was listing heavily to port, her deck awash, and her guns silenced forever. Her crew, displaying the courage that had made Spanish seamen legendary throughout history, continued to serve their remaining weapons until the rising water reached their magazine spaces. The USS Baltimore, under Captain Nehemiah Mayo Diaz, expert command, engaged the Spanish cruiser Don Juan de Austria, one of the few remaining vessels capable of offering meaningful resistance. The Spanish cruiser, though modern by their fleet standards, mounted guns that were no match for American heavy artillery. Shell after shell from the Baltimore's main battery found their mark, systematically dismantling the Spanish ship's fighting capability piece by piece. Admiral Montoyo, now aboard the gunboat Isla de Cuba, watched helplessly as his squadron disintegrated. Around him, the Spanish commander had fought with distinction in conflicts across the globe, but he had never faced an enemy with such overwhelming technological superiority. His obsolete fleet, brave as its crews were, simply could not compete with modern American naval architecture and gunnery techniques. The smaller, American vessels had by now closed to point-blank range, their rapid-fire guns sweeping Spanish decks clear of personnel and equipment. The USS Petrel engaged the Spanish gunboat Isla de Luzon at such close range that her guns could hardly miss, turning the enemy vessel into a floating wreck within minutes. The USS Concord systematically destroyed several Spanish torpedo boats, their wooden hulls no match for American steel and high explosives. Spanish shore batteries continued their futile bombardment, but their ancient guns posed no serious threat to the American squadron. Most of their shots fell harmlessly into the bay, while those few that found their targets merely bounced off modern armor plating. American counter-battery fire, though limited, quickly silenced the most troublesome Spanish positions with precise shooting that demonstrated superior optical range-finding equipment. By noon, the destruction was essentially complete. Every major Spanish vessel had been either sunk, captured, or burned beyond repair. The proud Spanish Pacific Squadron, which had ruled these waters for over 3 centuries, had been reduced to smoking wreckage in less than 7 hours of combat. Not a single American ship had been seriously damaged, and casualties were almost non-existent. The USS Olympia's signal flags conveyed Commodore, while Dewey's orders for the final phase of operations, the capture or destruction of remaining Spanish positions and the establishment of American control over Manila Bay. The Spanish flag still flew over Cavite Arsenal, but its garrison was in no position to offer meaningful resistance to American landing parties. Admiral Montoyo, his uniform torn and bloodied, finally struck his colors aboard the Isla de Cuba as American shells began to find their range on his last remaining vessel. The Spanish admiral's surrender marked the end of organized resistance, though individual Spanish sailors continued to fight from partially submerged vessels until ammunition was exhausted or their positions became untenable, according to documentation. From the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History, the Battle of Manila Bay represented one of the most complete naval victories in recorded history. Spanish casualties numbered 381 killed and wounded, while American losses totaled exactly 8 men, slightly wounded. No American vessel required major repairs, and the entire Spanish Pacific Squadron had been eliminated. As a fighting force, as the guns fell silent and smoke cleared from Manila Bay, the magnitude of American victory became apparent to observers on both sides. The Spanish colonial empire in the Pacific had suffered a blow from which it would never recover. The United States Navy had announced its emergence as a global naval power in the most dramatic fashion possible. Filipino insurgents along the shoreline cheered openly as they witnessed the destruction of Spanish naval power, believing that American victory would bring them the independence they had fought for so long. Spanish civilians in Manila watched in stunned silence as their empires, Pacific Fleet disappeared beneath the tropical waters, knowing that their world had changed forever in the space of a single morning. The silence that followed the guns of Manila Bay was profound and unsettling. As black smoke dissipated across the tropical waters, the full scope of American victory became visible to thousands of observers lining Manila's waterfront. Spanish naval power in the Pacific had been utterly destroyed, but the implications of this triumph would prove far more complex than anyone could have imagined on that fateful morning of May 1st. 1890-8. Commodore Dewey, standing on the bridge of his flagship USS Olympia, surveyed the scene of destruction with professional satisfaction tinged by the sobering reality of command. The Spanish fleet lay scattered across the bay floor or burning on the surface, their crews either dead, wounded, or swimming desperately toward shore. Yet the Commodore understood that military victory was only the beginning. He now faced the far more challenging task of governing a colonial territory populated by millions of people who had their own ideas about independence. The immediate aftermath required careful coordination between American naval forces and surviving Spanish authorities. Admiral Montoyo, though defeated, maintained his dignity and surrender and worked with Dewey to ensure proper treatment of wounded Spanish sailors. Many of these men, though enemies hours before, were pulled from the water by American rescue boats and treated by American medical personnel, with the courtesy due to brave adversaries, Filipino revolutionaries, led by the charismatic Emilio Aguinaldo. Initially viewed American victory as the dawn of their independence. Aguinaldo's forces had been fighting Spanish colonial rule for years, and they naturally assumed that American intervention would result in Filipino self-government. This assumption would prove tragically incorrect, as American imperial ambitions would soon clash with Filipino nationalist aspirations. The capture of Manila itself required delicate negotiations between American, Spanish, and Filipino forces. Spanish Governor General Fermin Yaudinez found himself in an impossible position. His naval defenses had been eliminated. His garrison was outnumbered, and his colonial administration was crumbling. Yet Spanish pride demanded that Manila not be surrendered without at least the appearance of resistance. What followed became known as the Mock Battle of Manila, a carefully choreographed engagement that allowed Spanish forces to surrender with honor while preventing Filipino insurgents from participating in the city's capture. This arrangement worked out in secret between Spanish and American commanders, demonstrated the cynical realism that would characterize American colonial policy in the Philippines. On August 13, 1898, American forces, under General Wesley Merritt, engaged Spanish defenders in a brief, largely bloodless battle that ended with Spanish surrender and American occupation of Manila. Filipino forces, despite their crucial assistance during the campaign, were excluded from the city and denied any role in the new colonial government that emerged. The Treaty of Paris, signed on December 10, 1898, formally ended the Spanish-American War and transferred the Philippines from Spanish to American control. This treaty, negotiated without Filipino participation, ignored the archipelago's declaration of independence and established American, a colonial rule that would last for nearly half a century. Commodore Dewey, promoted to admiral and hailed as a national hero, found himself governing a territory he barely understood. The Philippines contained hundreds of distinct ethnic groups speaking dozens of languages, united only by their shared experience of Spanish colonial oppression. American administrators, trained in the relatively straightforward task of governing states with established institutions, struggled to manage a complex society with radically different cultural traditions. The Philippine-American War, which erupted in February of 1899, proved far more costly and difficult than the brief naval engagement at Manila Bay. Filipino forces, trained in guerrilla warfare and intimately familiar with their homeland's geography, fought American occupying forces for over 3 years. This conflict resulted in thousands of American casualties and hundreds of thousands of Filipino deaths, making it one of America's bloodiest colonial wars. According to historical analysis by the Public Broadcasting Service, the Battle of Manila Bay marked America's transformation from a continental power to a global empire. But this transformation came at a tremendous cost in blood and treasure. The swift naval victory that had seemed to promise easy imperial expansion instead initiated decades of colonial conflict and cultural misunderstanding. Admiral Dewey's tactical brilliance at Manila Bay had demonstrated American naval superiority, beyond question, but it had also committed the United States to responsibilities and conflicts that would challenge the nation's democratic ideals for generations to come. The victory that had taken less than a day to achieve would require nearly 50 years to fully consolidate, and its consequences would shape American foreign policy well into the 20th century. The echoes of gunfire that rolled across Manila Bay on May 1st, 1898, continued to reverberate through American history long after Admiral George Dewey's squadron had steamed away from Philippine waters. The Battle of Manila Bay represented far more than a naval victory. It marked America's definitive emergence as a global power and initiated a complex colonial relationship that would fundamentally reshape both American foreign policy and Filipino society. Admiral Dewey returned to the United States as perhaps the most celebrated military hero since Ulysses Grant. His name synonymous with American naval supremacy and imperial expansion. Cities across the nation held parades in his honor. Babies were named after him, and politicians competed to associate themselves with his victory. The phrase, "You may fire when you are ready," gridly entered American folklore alongside other legendary military commands, symbolizing the decisive moment when America announced its arrival as a world power. The technological lessons learned at Manila Bay revolutionized naval warfare and shipbuilding across the globe. The battle demonstrated conclusively that wooden warships, regardless of their crew's courage, could not survive against modern steel vessels armed with high-explosive shells. Naval architects worldwide studied the engagement's details, leading to rapid advances in armor design, gunnery techniques, and fleet tactics that would define naval combat through both world wars. The Philippines themselves became America's first major overseas colony, a laboratory for imperial governance that would influence American policy in Puerto Rico, Guam, and later territories. The colonial administration established after Manila Bay's victory implemented infrastructure projects, educational systems, and governmental institutions that fundamentally altered Filipino society. Roads, schools, and hospitals built during the American period modernized the archipelago. While simultaneously suppressing indigenous culture and political independence, Filipino resistance to American colonial rule. Sparked by the betrayal of independence promises made during the Spanish-American War produced a guerrilla conflict that foreshadowed later American experiences in Vietnam and other imperial interventions. The Philippine-American War's brutality shocked many Americans who had supported the initial intervention, leading to the emergence of anti-imperialist movements that questioned American colonial policies and their compatibility with democratic principles. The strategic implications of controlling the Philippines extended far beyond the archipelago itself. American naval bases at Manila Bay and Subic Bay projected American power throughout the Western Pacific, enabling intervention in China during the Boxer Rebellion and establishing the United States as a major player in Asian geopolitics. These bases would prove crucial during World War II. When Japanese attacks on the Philippines initiated America's Pacific War, the Battle of Manila also established important precedents for American military doctrine and strategy. Emphasis on superior training, modern equipment, and aggressive tactics became hallmarks of American military culture. The battle's swift conclusion with minimal American casualties created unrealistic expectations for future conflicts, contributing to the splendid little war mentality that would influence American military planning for decades. Economic consequences of the victory proved equally significant. American businesses gained access to Philippine markets and resources, while Filipino agriculture was restructured to serve American industrial needs. This economic relationship created dependencies that persisted long after Philippine independence, shaping trade patterns and development policies throughout the 20th century. The battle's influence on American naval policy culminated in the Great White Fleet's world cruise of 1907 to 1909. when President Theodore Roosevelt dispatched 16 battleships on a global tour designed to demonstrate American naval power. This spectacular display of force, inspired partly by Dewey's Manila Bay victory, announced America's intention to play a major role in world affairs and helped establish the naval supremacy that would define American foreign policy throughout the coming century. Philippine independence, finally achieved on July 4, 1946, came only after World War II had demonstrated the impossibility of defending distant colonial territories against determined enemies. The Japanese occupation of the Philippines from 1942 to 1945 devastated the archipelago and convinced American policymakers that colonial empire was more burden than benefit in the modern world. Contemporary historians, writing with the perspective of more than a century, recognize the Battle of Manila Bay as a pivotal moment in both American and world history. The engagements, technological innovations, strategic consequences, and colonial aftermath established patterns of American international behavior that continue to influence global politics today. Admiral Dewey's victory announcement, "Squadron is in excellent health and spirits," proved prophetic in ways he never imagined. As American power and influence spread across the Pacific and around the world, the guns that thundered across Manila Bay on that distant morning in 1898 had indeed announced a new chapter in human history, though neither the victors nor the vanquished could have fully comprehended the magnitude of changes their brief battle would unleash upon the world.